Well, thank you very much, Caroline. I should say to those of you who don't know me that being an emeritus professor is a euphemism for being old. So this will be a multi-generational activity. It also allows you what I call power without responsibility. You're not looking for promotion, you're not looking for tenure, you don't report to a dean, so you say what you want. I suspect the reason I've been invited to speak to you is because of the report I wrote for IFA on populism, nationalism, and cultural relations. My presentation won't bear too much resemblance to that original report because it's 3 years ago. And I've just finished a book on called Civilizations, States, and the Reform of World Order. So what I'm going to do is to focus basically on the key themes of this that relate to culture. So it is relevant, but it's different to probably what was being expected. My presentation, of course, fits to the specific theme of the cultural divide across societies. It provides a global context within which to consider the role of culture in an era of populism and nationalism. And there are some slides, and if you want the slides, you're welcome to them. Now, in simple terms, there are three broad traditional categories within which to study international relations. There's the geostrategic and the geoeconomic. There's a third one, and it's emerged quite dramatically over the last few years, and it's what I call the geocultural and civilizational problematic. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. This is a contest, this geocultural civilizational problematic is a contest beyond geopolitics and beyond geoeconomics. And there are two key elements to it. The first is the emergence of populist nationalist resistance to Western universal values. And I'm going to state that rather than explain it, because I suspect everyone is familiar with it. The second factor fueling this trend is the reassertion of the virtues of the civilizational state, particularly as advanced by China, India, Russia, Turkey, and some smaller states. And it reflects a growing assertion of what I would call pre-Westphalian historical and cultural values. It comes from countries that measure histories in millennia rather than centuries. And it plays very strongly to their strengths. And so they now think of themselves more as civilizational states than as simply post-Westphalian modern states. As you know, there's been much false starts. There's been 2 or 3 false starts to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations arguments, which I've always found to be flawed and unfortunate. But I think we can identify in the last few years, and I use the alliteration deliberately, the rise of clashism. And the rise of clashism is nurtured by a narrative of cultural irreconcilability among states. Western scholars and practitioners of international relations work with a generic understanding of culture. Their understanding is largely culture as values, beliefs, customs, morals, and practices that reflect what Terry Eagleton would call a whole way of life. It's a broad view of culture, not the specific view of cultural relations and diplomacy that I produced in. We assume that culture creates coherent, bounded, constitutive communities. It doesn't. In the search for global order, there is always a tension between the pursuit of material economic and political security goals, the legitimate concerns of states, and their cultural normative values. Operating tools for the analysis of culture in international relations principally focus on what we might call the idea of shared meaning, that is, norms, values, and principles that make action understandable. But here again, values, norms, and principles are never perfectly defined. They're never universally agreed, and identifying them is a problematic exercise. But they are causally powerful, which is why we have to work with them. how do we get ourselves into a situation where populism and nationalist identity politics has grown, the civilization state has risen as a key factor in international relations? Basically, we've seen a complacency of liberal democratic elites. Basically, non-populist liberal actors, global actors, got trapped on the moral high ground. They were too slow to understand the disruptive impact of social media on traditional politics. And I appreciate that there are people in this audience who are much more specialist than me on this, but I identify what some have called the rise of quantum politics. That's akin to the move from Blockbuster to Netflix, if you want an analogy. In this context of quantum politics, politics becomes faster, less predictable, and atomistically random, hence quantum. Digital communication, social media, individualist online activity has revolutionized the nature of international politics, and it favors the disruptors. Contrary to the views of the early digital utopians who believed that the internet would set us free, this has not been a principal part of the experience. As Shoshona Zuboff tells us, it's become a source of monetized behavioral data, and politically, societal surveillance has grown. Cosmopolitan insouciance has effectively facilitated the rise of populism and nationalism. So there are 6 elements of populist nationalist cross-cultural relations or international relations at this time. Firstly, what I call it the populist nationalist zeitgeist, which are the expression I used in the 1917 report. The PNZ privileges sovereignty, nation, and identity over global cooperation. The PNZ exhibits a major skepticism towards globalization and economic openness, especially liberal trade regimes. Not without some justification, it needs to be said, but in a misunderstood way. The PNZ is skeptical towards the key principles of the European project, notably the idea of sovereignty pooling, the diminution of state sovereignty, the role of things like the European Court of Justice. It's skeptical of closer integration, accompanied by more government from Brussels. And of course, it exhibits a hostility towards immigration and cross-cultural fertilization. The PNZ also, ironically and surprisingly, exhibits a preference for relationships with Russia over the United States. And I say surprisingly, given the Trump administration's populist sympathies of the last 4 years and the support for populist strong men, and they're all men, such as Putin, Orban, Bolsonaro, and Duterte. In combination, the emergence of populist nativism and identity politics raises questions about the role of culture in international relations. Without assuming a previously homogeneous global order, we now have what is openly acknowledged as a culturally fragmented order that lacks a fig leaf of consensus that you could once say was imposed forcefully, it must be said, by the British Empire and by subsequent American hegemony. Growing cultural diversity is manifested in the burgeoning rhetoric of the civilizational state that is challenging the traditional liberal order that as we've understood it, semi-liberal order of the last 60 or 70 years. Now, this position is widely understood, but it's not just a scholarly concern. It casts massive policy shadows over the structure of the international order and the practice of international relations, in that context, cultural relations too. It causes us to ask if any international order can lay claims to being legitimate in the absence of a civilizational consensus in a culturally diverse world, and particularly where diversity cannot be managed or organized. We lack what we might call diversity regimes. And the problem, of course, is in the conversation between states and civilizations. The liberal Westphalian order of states has always assumed a superiority in the relationship between Western principally individual rights-based values, and non-Western values, such as notions of moral and community obligation. This is changing. We see Chinese and Indian diplomacy function in a framework that draws on their unique philosophical and cultural traditions and on a history measured in millennia, not centuries. The challenge for us is to address the cultural and historical and philosophical disconnects between this new civilizational statist activity and the traditional Western diplomacy, which operates on a mix of Greek philosophy, Roman classics, and Renaissance thinking. And it leads to two key questions, and I offer more questions than answers in this presentation. The first question is, are the differences of values and culture reflected in the civilization state irresolvable in the relationship with the traditional liberal order? Secondly, is it possible that a sense of community and moral solidarity with skill and political will could in actual fact be negotiated? I'm afraid I'm going to offer you a pessimistic view of this. Firstly, I want to talk about the limits of community and moral solidarity. The national state is the ultimate level to date of the imagined community, Ben Anderson's imagined community, Tony Judd's community of origins, things you'll understand, I'm sure. Can a world of different cultures and identities ever develop a sense of moral community? Can states create, give shape to, or kickstart moral transnational solidarity? These are not new questions, but they're increasingly pressing ones. A moral narrative extending social and political boundaries beyond the state to trans-sovereign global communities, to a community of destiny, as opposed to a community of origins, capable of dealing with humankind's trans-sovereign problems, eludes us. We don't have that. Human cultural evolution does not at present show us a way to enhance global cooperation, be it, for example, to tackle pandemics, climate change. Just to give you one example, I don't know whether you've seen the preposterous boasting of the Brits, unless those of you think I'm a Brit, I'm an Australian. The preposterous boasting of the Brits that they're the first people to have a COVID-19 vaccine. It's really offensive, but it's also depressing in terms of what it says about the prospects of developing a community of solidarity, a community of cooperation between cultures. If we're to move forward, we require a moral narrative that will enable us to extend social and political boundaries beyond the nation state to address the irresolvable national questions that can only be dealt with globally. Problems of well-being, poverty, inequality, problems of climate, problems of pandemic. But we don't have those narratives. Creating a meta-narrative of culture and civilization, despite several millennia in the making, has yet to catch on. One of the problems that we have is that our genetic and cultural evolution does not extend beyond the state to global cooperation. Huntingtonian classism is emerging, I'm afraid, as a problem facing global order. The struggle between the US and China nowadays is much more about culture, politics, and identity than it is about simple issues of trade. I've got one last slide. So what do we think about the future? We live in troubled times. Trump may be going, although I won't believe it until we nail the coffin lid down, but Trumpism is not going. Populism may be waning, but national cultural identity appears to be growing fiercer. Now, of course, history does tell us that cultural landscapes do change and that cultural landscapes can be cultivated. But the idea of a civilizational state is a powerful socio-cultural tool in international relations. And we're often overly optimistic about the power of culture in international relations. And our optimism is often made using only scant anecdotal evidence. The report I did for IFA is based on anecdotal evidence rather than any scientific quantitative analysis. Such assumptions, the optimistic power of culture, are often sadly overrated. So I'm going to leave you with 4 linked questions. Can we operationalize culture, increasingly populist in tone, to enhance global cooperation in a time when global cooperation is desperately needed? Can the existing institutions that we have and the structures that we have accommodate cultural diversity, where cultural diversity leads not to a genuine open dialogue between different cultures, but to increasing antagonism and combativeness? Can we I was referred to as being cosmopolitan in Caroline's introduction. Cosmopolitanism, as you know, is just about the dirtiest word in the populist lexicon. I know Caroline is not a populist. She was trying to pass me a compliment, but if you're a populist, calling someone a cosmopolitan isn't a way of being nice to them. But it misunderstands what we mean by cosmopolitanism. So my question here is, can we rehabilitate cosmopolitanism sufficiently to counter communitarian populist relativism? Can we create a global community of destiny as opposed to an imagined community or a community of origin? So these 4 questions taken together, I think, are basically what I would call the big cultural ticket items in contemporary international relations. And in some ways, they're as important as the geopolitical strategic questions and the geoeconomic questions in the 21st century. The degree to which we're capable of addressing them is going to basically determine what the nature of world order reform will look like in the next, certainly in the lifetime of the younger people in this audience, but also in the next 10, 15 years of my life, if I'm lucky enough. This is the big question, and I'm pleased to say I'll have a book coming out on this early next year. I have lots of questions, but no answers. So Caroline, I will finish.